Now I'll analyze Adolf Hitler's birth chart from tropical and sidereal perspectives so that we can compare the two. And we'll also take a look at some of the timing and dates of things. So one of the things that everybody knows is here's the guy who killed everybody, right? He's an absolutely ruthless, brutal personality. He was responsible for 11 to 12 million deaths. That's more than anybody else in history. Something else that may be kind of known about him is master strategist, not necessarily a war strategist, but a master strategist. He was able to rise from homelessness, almost homelessness and poverty, to being the head of his country, the absolute dictator. And the way that he did that was by strategy, especially by understanding how human beings work, understanding the dynamics of emotions and manipulating them. And he also was an expert orator, really convincing speaker. Another thing that's less well known about Hitler is that he was an artist. In fact, it was his dream to be an artist, not a evil dictator. And it was his father who screwed up that dream. And that's another important thing about him is his father and his mother. His father, he was always at odds with his father. His father was a dictator in the family, very rough, harsh person. And his mother was very kind and gentle and always tried to make things better for Adolf, make Adolf feel better. And Adolf Hitler was absolutely devoted to his mother. This is one thing that may not be so well known. She died when he was 18. He lived for 4 years in complete poverty after his mother died. And the reason why he was living in poverty was because he was trying to live as an artist. And so he was just selling watercolor paintings. And by the way, his paintings were pretty good. Besides wanting to be an artist, he's also an avid fan of architecture. He designed the swastika thing. He was a good designer, and he was an avid fan of music. He was completely into German opera. One other thing about him is he's a terrible student and terrible with authorities, which is probably why he winds up as a dictator, because he doesn't cooperate with other authorities at all. One other thing that's important to know about Hitler, which is not really so clear, this man was not spiritual at all. He was entirely extremely practical, pragmatic. His morals were survival of the fittest. The strongest person should take over, and if we lose this war, that means that we don't deserve to win the war. That means we don't deserve to rule the world. So he was not spiritual. He was involved with some people who were into the occult in the early years of his adulthood, but he didn't take a liking for that. His vegetarianism may be a question. Why was he vegetarian if he wasn't spiritual? He believed that it would make the human being more strong to be vegetarian. He believed in the survival of the fittest thing, so he had a great love for wolves, lions, and would hate to see human beings cause violence to animals. But don't make the mistake that he was into the Vedas or he was into spirituality or religion, because he wasn't. Okay, so let's begin our astrological analysis. Regardless of the zodiac you use, the main thing in Hitler's chart is there's an absolute conjunction of Venus and Mars. So that causes something called Yuddha, which is war, Graha Yuddha, and then Venus never loses in a war. So Mars loses Graha Yuddha to Venus, regardless of your zodiac system. If you're not clear on whether this means, well, Venus conquers Mars, so that means love conquers war, it doesn't mean that. So what happens with Graha Yuddha is the losing planet forfeits all of its assets and traits and qualities to the winning planet. So the person who wins the war takes all the booty, takes all the loot, gets all the assets from the losing planet. So if you think about that, that means that Venus is getting invested with all sorts of martial resources and qualities. Now, another thing that's very important, regardless of the system you use, is that Venus and Mars are both in a mutual aspect with Saturn. Now, I should say, regardless of the system you use, if you use Parashari Vedic astrology and you actually use Parashari aspects. So the key thing in this chart then is Mars and Venus in a war, Venus winning Mars's assets, all the while both of them being aspected by Saturn. So this Venus of Adolf Hitler is getting infused by both Mars and Saturn. So his major benefic is being infused by both malefics. Another interesting factor about this, regardless of the zodiac, is that both Venus and Mars are in Bharani, Nakshatra, the constellation of Bharani. When Venus beats Mars in Graha Yuddha, it means the assets of war and violence and anger are given to Venus. She can use them if she wants. Now, she's getting the aspect from Saturn as well, so she's going to be inclined to use them. And furthermore, she's in Bharani, which is the nakshatra of Yama, who's the god of death. And this Bharani nakshatra is practically the strongest, harshest, strictest nakshatra that there is. So Venus is surrounded by extreme harshness and strictness from its nakshatra, from the mutual aspect with Saturn, and from the exact conjunction with Mars. Okay, and this is a major factor in this person's chart. This is the major thing, and this is independent of what zodiac you use to look at it. Another interesting thing that's true in both zodiacs for Hitler is his ascendant is Libra, similar to Donald Trump. In both cases, his ascendant is Leo. So since we have Libra as the ascendant for both zodiacs, that Venus there that we were talking about is not ignorable. This is the first lord of the first house. Now, because Venus is the first lord, because Libra is rising, that means that Mars is the second and seventh. So Mars is a real Maraka. We say Maraka in Vedic astrology, which means a death bringer. The planet that owns a second or a seventh house can bring death. Mars owns both, and himself, by his nature, is violent. And it's in Bharani. It's in a mutual aspect with Saturn. But this guy's incredibly successful and famous too, right? So because Libra is the ascendant, Venus is the first lord, Mars is the seventh lord, their combination makes Raja Yoga. This is incredibly tight Raja Yoga. And also Saturn then is the fifth lord, and the Yoga Karaka, the fifth and the fourth lord. So its mutual aspect with Mars is also a Raja Yoga, and its mutual aspect with Venus is also a Raja Yoga. So regardless of the zodiac, this Venus is an incredible power because of having 3 Raja Yogas affecting it, and in incredibly brutal conditions because of being affected by Saturn, Mars, Bharani, and the Maraka. One other thing that's true regardless of the zodiac is that the ascendant is in the Chitra constellation, nakshatra of Chitra. Chitra is a nakshatra which gives a lot of clarity, a lot of comprehension for beauty or art, a lot of comprehension of architecture, design, things like that. Yet another factor which is true in either zodiac is that this man's Jupiter and Moon are super close together and pretty close to Ketu. So this explains, mysteriously powerful oratory. All of them are in Purva Ashada, which is the nakshatra for strategy and planning. And this moon is particularly interesting because it's just in Purva Ashada, so it's kind of straddling the border between Mula, which can be a very violent force. It's straddling the border between Mula and Purva Ashada. So it's pulling on both influences. With Ketu, Jupiter, Moon in Purva Ashada with some tie to Mula, and Ketu is there, you get a very conspiratorial strategist, which is exactly who Hitler is. Now, this clump over here, Jupiter, Moon, and Ketu, and that other clump over here of Venus and Mars, they're in a perfect trine to each other. And we got Jupiter in here who gives 100% aspect to a trine. So that Jupiter in Purva Ashada gives a huge influence to the first lord. So look at this chart as an outstanding person. Why? Because this Venus is off the charts with Raj Yogas. It's one of war. It's getting influence from Saturn. Exactly. A mutual influence from Saturn. Complete influence from Jupiter. Jupiter is carrying the influence from Ketu and the moon with it. So practically everything is focused on this Venus, the first lord. Now bear in mind that thus far we have not given one damn about which zodiac we're using. Everything that I've mentioned so far will be true if you use a tropical zodiac or a sidereal zodiac. Because nakshatras are independent from the zodiac, we always keep them sidereal. What I want to demonstrate here is how much of the horoscope comes through, regardless of the zodiac, quite a lot. The majority of the interpretation of the horoscope can be derived independently from the zodiac. This is why if you're using the wrong one, you can still do good readings. And this is also why a debate about whether the tropical zodiac or the sidereal zodiac is right is not going to be solved by looking at birth charts. It's going to be solved by looking at logic, history, and authoritative statements. But for fun and for interest, and to prove this point, I like to do these videos to compare the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac side by side. So now let's do that. Let's take a look at how the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac differ. One difference is that in sidereal, this Venus of Adolf Hitler is in the 7th house, but in tropical, it's in the 8th house. Okay, these two houses are quite similar. They can be quite similar. However, the 7th house has more of a sense of relating with people, but the 8th has more of a mysterious, subversive feeling than the 8th does. Also, in sidereal, the reason why Venus is in the 7th house with the whole sign system is because it's in Aries in sidereal, whereas in tropical, it's in the 8th because it's in Taurus. Now, Taurus is Venus's own sign. And Aries is the sign of an enemy, and Venus is with this enemy in the same house, which by the regular rules of Vedic astrology means that dignity is even worse. So in a sidereal case, the first lord of Hitler is in a really bad dignity. In a tropical case, the first lord of Hitler is in a really good dignity. Now you want to say, well, this guy is an evil person. Maybe he should have a first lord in bad dignity. But bad dignity means he's going to be weak. It's not going to be able to really carry these Raj Yogas to being successful. And also the nature of the 7th house is that it makes things disappear. Whereas the nature of the 8th house, which is quite similar, is not that it makes things disappear, but it makes things operate in secrecy. So since Hitler was immensely successful, he went from living in like a homeless shelter to almost taking over Europe. So this guy is incredibly successful, whether good or evil, certainly evil, right? But incredibly successful. It's not likely that his first lord is weak. So that's one difference. Sidereal has the Venus in an unfriendly sign. Tropical has it strong in its own sign. Another difference here is that with sidereal, you get Sun and Mars in Aries too. Now, Sun and Mars in Aries is a great lineup. And it's particularly going to affect the person's relationship with authorities. But Hitler's hallmark of his entire life is to completely clash with authorities. It had to be his way or no way at all. There was no second authority except him. And in his childhood, he was always at odds with his father, physically fighting with his father, or getting beaten by his father, constantly in trouble at school, etc. So in tropical, the Sun and Mars are in Taurus, where they clash with the ruler. And it's in the 8th house, which makes it more problematic, more subversive, a sense of wanting to subvert authority, conventions, and hierarchies. On a similar theme, look at Saturn, the difference between tropical and sidereal Saturn. Sidereally, Saturn is in Cancer, and tropically, Saturn is in Leo. Saturn in Cancer is more depressive than it is argumentative. But Saturn in Leo is very argumentative with authority figures and gets into clashes with father figures and things like that. So the sidereal picture with Saturn in Cancer and Sun and Mars in Aries doesn't paint the picture of Hitler, who's completely terrible with dealing with any other authority than himself. Well, the tropical picture paints that very accurately, with Saturn in Leo aspecting Mars in Taurus, with the Sun also in Taurus. And also, if you consider that in sidereal, the Saturn in Cancer is in the 10th house. So that means that the depressive energy of Saturn in Cancer is going to affect how he deals with the public. Hitler was incredibly assertive. Incredibly confident, assertive, wildly outgoing. Saturn in Cancer in the 10th house doesn't really look like that. But compare it to the 10th house in the tropical chart where you get Rahu. That matches better. One final thing is that let's look at Jupiter, the conditions of Jupiter compared to sidereal and tropical. Sidereally, Jupiter is in Sagittarius. Ooh, Jupiter in Sagittarius is great with education. Likes teachers, can be a teacher, and has a sense of morality which is idealistic, which doesn't match the fact that Hitler was not idealistic. He was super practical and pragmatic. He was not good with teachers. He was constantly clashing with teachers and didn't trust anybody. I mean, Sagittarius is a trusting thing. Whereas with the tropical chart, Hitler's Jupiter, Moon, and Ketu are in Capricorn. That's perfect, right? Because Jupiter in Capricorn gets a Machiavellian morality, gets a pragmatic morality. Practicality is the moral. Whatever works, whatever's the strongest, whatever lasts the longest is the best. Jupiter in Capricorn is distrusting, especially of teachers. So what I hope you can see, by first doing what's common to both zodiacs and then showing what's different between the two zodiacs, what I hope you can see is that you can get a pretty clear picture of Adolf Hitler, regardless of which zodiac you use. But if you want to split hairs and try to get an exactly clear picture of him, the tropical zodiac is going to lead you in the right direction much more easily than the sidereal zodiac, which is going to lead you astray. Now, what I'd also like to do in this video, since people had asked for it in the other two videos that I did, Trump and Einstein, you might notice that I'm doing slightly different things. In each one, in Trump, I really looked at the divisional charts. In Einstein, I showed you how to use the sun and the moon charts. And here, the new thing about this analysis I want to show you is timing. Let's see how the timing works. So let's just stick with the regular Vimshottari Dasha system, which is the kind of de facto Vedic timing system. So here's the key dates in Hitler's life. When he was 14 in 1903, his father died. Then in 1907, his mother died. In 1909, he ran out of money and became nearly homeless. And from 1909 to 1914, he was living in that very poor situation, trying to be an artist. 1914, he was finally able to successfully enlist in the army. He was unsuccessful previous. So he's living on the street. He wants to enlist in the army. Then in 1920 to 23, it's after World War I, he starts to gradually get his life together and become powerful. He's involved in a lot of espionage, like infiltrating this political group, spy on them, stuff like that, for the army. He's remained in the army. So he starts to get his life together from 1920 to 1923. In 1923, he tries to take over the government. So he becomes quite powerful over those 3 years from 1920 to 1923. In 1923, he actually tries to take over the German government with a coup d'etat, and it fails. And he wound up in prison he spent the year of 1924 in prison. Interestingly, he's supposed to be in there for 5 years, but everybody liked him so much and he was so persuasive that he got out and won. What he did in prison that year was write a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. And that book was extremely influential and helped him further increase his power. After he got out of prison, he realized that he couldn't do a violent takeover and that he would have to do a legal political takeover. From 1925 to 1930, he's gradually figuring out how to gain political power. In 1932, he actually almost became elected president, but came in second. But because he was so good at manipulating everything, by 1933, the person who was elected president wound up appointing him to be the president, or whatever, the chancellor or whatever. By 1933, he's the leader of Germany and becomes a dictator. And what does he start doing? Defying all authorities, breaking all the German laws, changing all the German laws, breaking all the agreements with that were formed at the end of World War I, and expanding his army. By 1939, he launches an attack on Poland, which is the thing which starts World War II. And for a couple of years, I would say maybe 2 years, the war is kind of going in his favor. But by the time we get to 1941, he starts to fall apart, starts to lose the war, starts to make some mistakes. Again, not trusting the authorities in his army. You have 4 years of where it's deteriorating, and then by 1945, he's done. He kills himself. The war is over. He says, well, we weren't the master race. So he kills himself. All right, so let's see how these dates fit into his Dasha. He's born in the Venus period, and it went up until his 18th year. And that was when he was struggling to try to convince his father that he should be allowed to be an artist. In any chart is going to be Chitra rising and Libra rising, so it makes sense that he would want to be an artist. But particularly, it would make sense that he wants to be an artist when Venus is in Taurus, as it is in tropical, instead of Venus in Aries. By 1907, he switches to the Sun period. This is a key factor in showing the sidereal zodiac to be inferior in describing Hitler's. 1907 is when his life tanked. Right? His mother dies. He runs out of money. He spends 4 or 5 years, 1909 to 1914, living in a homeless shelter. So should that be the Dasha of an exalted sun? Or should it be the Dasha of Sun in the 8th house in an enemy sign with that enemy planet? And actually, this period, during the Sun period, is where he was really trying to make a career as an artist. And that's the Sun in Taurus. When you get to 1913, he switches into the Moon period, and that's when his life starts to improve. And actually, that's where he gives up on his dream to be an artist. And he instead decides to start trying to enlist in the army. So should this be the Moon in Sagittarius, which is so idealistic and has lofty goals, big goals? Or should this be the Moon in Capricorn, as it is in tropical, which is practical and detached? So when his Moon period came in, he finally got practical and detached from his artistic dreams and said, let's join the army. So Moon Dasha goes from 1913 to 1923. So that means it's covering the whole time that he's rising in power by spying on people and assembling organizations out of other organizations. 1923 was when he tried to do his coup d'etat. In 1923, that's exactly when his Mars Dasha begins. But it was a failure. So should that be Mars in Aries, or should it be Mars in Taurus? Okay, in either case, Mars loses a war to Venus. So it's understandable that his failure would come. But it's more clear in tropical where it's Mars in Taurus losing a war than it is Mars in Aries losing a war. Also, another thing about it is Mars Dasha, however, that does point strongly to the tropical zodiac, is that he spent time in prison during his Mars Dasha. So should we see Mars in the 7th or the 8th house to indicate prison? Now, Mars Dasha goes up to 1930. In Mars Dasha, he tries to have a coup d'etat, fails, gets put in prison, but yet comes out on top anyway, publishes a book, and then starts learning about how to do politics the right way. Then it's by 1930 that he becomes, this is when his Rahu period starts, and this is where he gets to be the president in the 30s. He takes over Germany, he takes over the army, he starts trying to take over the world. So his extreme rise to fame was in the Rahu Dasha. Sidereally, his house of fame has got Saturn in Cancer, and Rahu is in the 9th house, which is okay, but tropically, he's got the 10th house, the house of fame, with Rahu in it. What I'm trying to say is most of the clarity in reading a chart comes from factors that don't differ all that much in most cases from tropical or sidereal zodiac. But when you go into the fine details that really confirm or confuse your interpretation, but generally, most often, the tropical zodiac gives you an easier way to suss out the finer details to confirm and not confuse your interpretation. And hopefully that's what I demonstrated in this video. Thank you.